The email arrived at 6:47 in the morning, and it ended 11 years of pretending. Effective immediately, all warehouse contract staff are terminated as part of Sterling Industries restructuring. Severance: none. Thank you for your service. Ryan Cole read it twice, standing in the loading dock in his gray uniform, a forklift key still in his hand. Around him, 40 other workers stared at their phones with the same slack, disbelieving expression. Men and women who had given years to this warehouse, who had never once met the people who just erased their jobs with a single paragraph. 11 years, muttered old Marcus, the dock supervisor, staring at his screen like it might change its mind. 11 years, and they couldn't even sign it with a name. Ryan folded the key into his palm and said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that silence was safer than reaction. But something in his chest, something that had been quiet for over a decade, had just opened one eye. Because Ryan Cole was not, in fact, a warehouse worker who had spent 11 years driving forklifts and eating lunch alone in a stairwell. Ryan Cole was the only son of Nathaniel Cole, the man who had built Sterling Industries from a single manufacturing plant into a $14 billion empire, and the man whose accidental death in a car crash 11 years ago had made his younger brother, Desmond Cole, the company's CEO. Ryan had been 23 when the crash happened. He remembered waking up in a hospital room he wasn't supposed to survive, remembered a nurse telling him quietly, when no one else was listening, that the brake lines on his father's car hadn't failed on their own. He remembered his Uncle Desmond visiting his hospital bed with flowers and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, saying, "It's just you and me now, kid. I'll take care of everything." He remembered understanding, with the particular clarity that only trauma provides, that if Desmond knew he was still alive and still asking questions, he wouldn't stay alive for long. So Ryan Cole had done the only thing that made sense. He let the world believe Nathaniel Cole's son had died alongside him. He changed nothing about his face and everything about his life, took a warehouse job under his mother's maiden name, and spent 11 years learning, patiently, exactly how deep the rot in his father's company really went. Today, apparently, was the day the rot decided to fire him. Part 1. The long wait to understand why Ryan smiled, just slightly, just for a second. When he read that termination email, you have to understand what those 11 years had actually been. He hadn't spent them hiding. He'd spent them building. Every night after his shift, in a small apartment above a laundromat 3 miles from the warehouse, Ryan had used a second identity, a freelance financial analyst named R. Coleman, to quietly track every irregular transaction flowing out of Sterling Industries, shell companies in Malta, consulting contracts paid to firms that didn't exist, a restructuring fund that had somehow moved $400 million through 6 different accounts in the last 3 years alone, always just beneath the threshold that would trigger a regulatory audit. He had learned to read a balance sheet the way other people read a story, where the lie started, where it thickened, where someone had gotten sloppy because they assumed no one was ever going to look. He'd found his father's original founding contract, buried in a public records archive which specified something Desmond had spent a decade making sure no one remembered. 34% of Sterling Industries' voting shares had been placed in an irrevocable trust for Nathaniel Cole's biological children, activated automatically upon proof of survival, regardless of any prior declaration of death. Desmond didn't know that trust still existed. Desmond had spent 11 years believing his nephew was in a grave outside the city, and had built his entire empire on that assumption. Ryan had one more thing Desmond didn't know about: a name. 2 years into his investigation, in a folder buried inside a shell account tied to the crash investigation, Ryan had found the mechanic's name. The man who'd been paid, 6 days before the crash, to make sure Nathaniel Cole's car failed at exactly the wrong moment on exactly the wrong stretch of road. He'd kept that name in a locked drawer for years, the way you keep a knife you're not ready to use yet. Today, Desmond had just fired the wrong man from a warehouse he owned a third of. Part 2. The woman who noticed there was one person at Sterling Industries who had, over the years, started to notice that something about Ryan Cole didn't add up. Elena Marsh, an internal auditor 2 floors above the warehouse who had crossed paths with him exactly 4 times, always briefly, always memorably. The first time he'd corrected a shipping manifest error that should have taken a certified accountant 20 minutes to catch. Ryan had caught it in 4, standing at a loading dock without looking at a single spreadsheet. The second time, she'd overheard him quietly explaining amortization schedules to a co-worker studying for a business degree, in language more precise than most of the junior finance hires she'd trained herself. The third time, she noticed he flinched, just barely, just for a second. Every time Desmond Cole's name came up on the warehouse floor's overhead announcements. The fourth time was the morning of the termination email, when she found him sitting alone in the break room, not panicking like everyone else, just quietly, calmly, typing something into his phone with the focus of a man closing a chess match rather than losing a job. "You don't seem very upset," she said, sitting down across from him with her coffee, more curious than accusing. Ryan looked up. For just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation, maybe, or relief, or both. "I've been expecting something like this for a long time," he said. 11 years of warehouse work and they can't even give you severance," Elena said. "That's not restructuring, that's a company hollowing itself out from the inside and blaming the furniture on the way down." Ryan studied her for a long moment. "You audit the executive accounts, don't you?" Elena's spine straightened slightly. "I audit what they let me audit." "And what happens when you find something they don't want found?" She hesitated. 2 years ago, I flagged an irregular transfer pattern in the restructuring fund. I was told it was above my clearance and reassigned to supply chain reporting the next week." Ryan nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he'd already suspected. "What if I told you," he said quietly, "that I have 3 years of documentation on exactly where that money went, who authorized it, and why?" Elena set down her coffee. "Who are you?" Ryan reached into his jacket and produced a small weathered photograph, a family portrait faded at the edges. A boy of maybe 12, standing beside a tall man with kind eyes and Ryan's exact jawline, in front of a building Elena recognized immediately as Sterling Industries' original headquarters. "My name," he said, "isn't Ryan Cole. Well, it is, just not the way you think." Part 3. The Board Meeting. Desmond Cole had scheduled the quarterly board meeting for the following Thursday, expecting the usual: mild questions about margins, polite nods about the necessary efficiencies of the recent restructuring, and a unanimous vote to approve his proposed sale of Sterling Industries' manufacturing division to a shell buyer that, unbeknownst to the board, he personally controlled through 4 layers of holding companies. What he did not expect was a name appearing on the meeting's attendee list that he had personally insured 11 years ago, would never appear on any list again. R.N. Cole, shareholder, 34% voting trust. Desmond's hand actually shook when he saw it on the printed agenda. He told himself it had to be an error, a clerical mistake, some distant cousin's paperwork resurfacing after a decade of dormancy. He told himself this right up until the boardroom doors opened and a man walked in wearing a gray warehouse jacket over a suit, carrying a leather folder, with his father's exact eyes and his father's exact silence. "You're supposed to be dead," Desmond said before he could stop himself. The rest of the boardroom went very, very quiet. "I was for a while," Ryan said, taking the empty chair at the head of the table that had sat unused for 11 years. "Turns out that was the safest thing I could do, given that somebody paid a mechanic to make sure my father never made it home from a business dinner." The color drained from Desmond's face in real time. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he managed. "You will," Ryan said, "in about 4 minutes." He opened the leather folder and slid a single page across the table. A bank transfer confirmation, dated 6 days before the crash, $5,000 moved from a Desmond Cole personal holding account to a private garage mechanic named Victor Hale. Memo line consulting fee. "Victor Hale gave a statement 2 weeks ago," Ryan continued, voice level, almost gentle, the way a surgeon might describe an incision. "Turns out 11 years is a long time to carry a secret alone." He was more than willing to talk, once he understood the statute of limitations question had already been resolved in his favor, in exchange for full cooperation. Desmond's mouth opened. Nothing came out. But that's not actually why I'm here today, Ryan said, turning to address the rest of the board, most of whom were now staring at him like he'd walked in carrying a live grenade. I'm here because my father's founding trust, the one specifying that 34% of this company's voting shares transfer to his surviving biological children, has just been formally activated, verified, and filed with the SEC as of 9 o'clock this morning. A murmur went through the room. Which means, Ryan continued, I'm now the single largest shareholder at this table, and I'd like to use my first vote to request a full independent audit of the restructuring fund, the manufacturing division sale, and every shell entity connected to Cole Holdings Group, which, for the board's information, is a private company Desmond Cole has quietly controlled since approximately 18 months after my father's death. This is outrageous, Desmond finally managed, standing. You have no proof of... I have 3 years of documentation, Ryan said calmly, prepared with the help of your own internal auditor, who you demoted the moment she got too close to the truth. He nodded toward the door, where Elena Marsh stood waiting, a certified copy of her own financial findings in hand, having been quietly reinstated to full auditing authority that same morning by a court order Ryan had spent the last 6 weeks securing. The room fell into the particular silence that only accompanies the exact moment someone's entire life, quietly, irreversibly ends. Part 4. What Justice Actually Looks Like. The investigation that followed took 4 months. Desmond Cole was removed from his position within the week, pending the board's formal review, and placed under federal investigation for wire fraud, embezzlement, and, pending the outcome of Victor Hale's full testimony, conspiracy charges connected to his brother's death. Ryan didn't gloat. He didn't hold a press conference or throw a party. He went, instead, to the warehouse. He walked onto the loading dock floor where he'd spent 11 years, still in the same gray jacket, and found old Marcus and the rest of the crew standing in a stunned half-circle, having just watched the news break across every screen in the break room. You're him, Marcus said slowly. You're the Cole kid. The one who died. I never died, Ryan said. I just needed everyone to think I had, until I had enough to make sure the people responsible couldn't hurt anyone else. You worked here, with us, for 11 years. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. You could have walked in with lawyers and money on day one. If I had, Ryan said, I never would have understood what this company actually does to the people who keep it running. I never would have known Sarah in receiving has been covering her sister's chemotherapy on a salary that hasn't moved in 6 years. I never would have known the safety inspections in Bay 4 have been falsified since before I got here. I needed to know this company from the ground up, not just the boardroom down. He reached into his jacket and produced a new document, not a leather folder full of evidence this time, but a simple, 1-page memo, already signed. Effective today, he said. Every warehouse employee terminated in this morning's restructuring email is reinstated with full back pay, full severance owed, and a 15% raise as compensation for the disruption. And effective this quarter, warehouse staff will have a permanent voting seat on the Sterling Industries board. The room went very quiet, and then, slowly, it didn't. Elena Marsh found Ryan on the roof of the Sterling Industries headquarters that evening, watching the city lights the way a man might watch something he'd spent 11 years being told he wasn't allowed to want. You didn't have to give the warehouse workers a board seat, she said, joining him at the railing. Nobody would have blamed you for just taking the company back and moving on. My father used to say something, Ryan said quietly. He said a company isn't the building or the balance sheet. It's every person who shows up every day to keep it running, whether or not the people at the top ever bothered to learn their names. He looked out over the skyline. Desmond forgot that. I don't intend to. What happens now? Elena asked. Now, Ryan said. We find out if a company built by a good man, stolen by a bad one, and reclaimed by his son can actually be worth what it was supposed to be in the first place. Elena smiled slightly. That's a very patient answer for someone who just took down a $14 billion conspiracy in one boardroom. Patience, Ryan said, is the only thing that actually beats people like Desmond. He always assumed loud was the same as powerful. He never noticed the quiet ones, the ones still standing at the end, long after everyone stopped watching them. Below them, the city moved on, unaware that somewhere above it, a company that had spent 11 years quietly rotting from the inside had just, finally, started to heal. Epilogue, 6 months later. Sterling Industries' quarterly earnings report showed something unusual for a company of its size. A modest dip in short-term profit margins, attributed directly to across-the-board wage increases and safety infrastructure investment across all warehouse facilities. Analysts called it an unusual, even risky strategic choice. Employee retention across every Sterling Industries facility rose to the highest levels the company had recorded in over a decade. Desmond Cole's trial began that spring. Victor Hale's full testimony combined with Elena Marsh's financial documentation resulted in a conviction that made headlines for exactly one news cycle before the world, as it always does, moved on to the next story. Ryan Cole gave no interviews. He returned, occasionally and without announcement, to the warehouse floor, where the newest hires had started calling him, half-jokingly and entirely fondly, the boss who still knows how to drive a forklift. And on his desk in the office that had once belonged to his father sat a single framed photograph, a boy of 12, standing beside a tall man with kind eyes, in front of a building that, after everything, had finally become what it was always supposed to be. Some people wait years for revenge. Ryan Cole had waited 11 and found something better on the other side of it.